While Napoleon's soldiers were marching across vast stretches of land to conquer more and more territory, they were hungry. How did this war lead to something as cunning as canned foods? Find out how on Quirky Science.
Once upon a time, the tin can was a miracle, something that could store food for months. Now, the tin can's ubiquitous. Worldwide, over 200 billion of them are made every year. And not just your boring cans of tuna or baked beans either. No, pretty much any foodstuff can be wrapped in metal, from oysters to pork legs, from evaporated milk to full-size hamburgers. How can it be that food suddenly stays good when it's put in a can? And who was it who came up with this marvellous idea?
Remember Napoleon Bonaparte? That French fellow who wanted to dominate Europe? Not an easy task. For one, Napoleon had to deal with the many mouths to feed whilst delegating a large and expanding army on the move. In 1795, Napoleon announced a contest with a prize of 12,000 francs for the person who could come up with the most innovative method of preserving food. Today, that would be about 56,000 US dollars, a prize worth fighting for. The winner was a Parisian man named Nicolas Francois Appert. After experimenting for 15 years, Appert came up with this idea of bottling. He thought that food would spoil when exposed to air as wine did, and so he submitted a method of boiling food in wide-mouth bottles, sealing them with a cork and pitch, making them airtight. In effect, the bottle becomes a small pressure cooker in which the food boils at temperatures higher than 100 degrees. The pressure cooker had actually been invented about 100 years earlier, in the late 17th century, by French physicist and mathematician Denis Papin. He had made a large cast iron vessel with a tightly fitted lid that locked and dubbed it digester. It was able to make the hardest bones of beef itself as soft as cheese. And yet Appert didn't know how or why the food didn't spoil half as fast when bottled. Nor did anyone else, for that matter. It took another 50 years before someone found out why the preservation process worked so well. But that didn't matter to Napoleon, who quickly provided his soldiers with bottled food. As Napoleon said, an army marches on its stomach. And the French army did come close to conquering all of Europe. The hungry soldiers must have been thankful. Unfortunately, the bottles had one minor problem. Glass is heavy and breakable. Yes, the logistics of carrying bottles around are not easy, especially during battle. So mankind was still looking for a method of preservation that did not include the fragility and weight of glass packaging. Well, if the French military was to travel farther and longer on the provisions it carried, then other armies needed to do so as well. The early 1800s was a time when trading and colonizing expeditions led people to travel farther and farther, and the need for preserved food grew. But wouldn't it be nice if the food was stored in less fragile containers? One British businessman by the name of Peter Durand thought he could do better. And what was his idea? Lightweight containers made out of tin plates.
And so, the can was born. But we're not quite there yet. For the first few decades of its life, this little monster had some bloody and even lethal characteristics.
In its early days, the can was actually too expensive for most people. because each can had to be handmade, and the food had to be cooked for hours on end. At the time, the main market for tinned food was the Army and Navy. Although the tins were sold widely from the start, there remained one very important problem: the quality of the canned food itself. In fact, it would take many more years after this invention to actually make it safe. One of the problems was working out how to get the food properly contained. To seal the tins, the early methods of manufacturing employed poisonous lead solder, which was found to lead to anything from amnesia to joint pains and even depression. Clearly, canning is not that easy or safe, but people did try this at home, and what resulted as one of the primary dangers of home canned foods was poisoning from botulism, which can and did result in death.
One thing that can go wrong with canned foods is that microorganisms survive the heat. That's something the French and British armies didn't truly understand. But when foods are boiled, the following principle applies. Destruction of bacteria increases tenfold for every 10-degree increase in temperature. As ever, my trusty experts are primed and ready to demonstrate. This batch, for example, was cooked at 20 degrees. After leaving a sample of it to grow on a special plate, it looks like this. Let's have a look at another batch. The growth of bacteria as a result of cooking the food 20 degrees higher. So what's the difference between these plates? Well, the more heat and pressure that are applied during processing, the more air is forced from the cans, and this minimises the multiplication of disease-causing organisms. Mind you, some of these organisms, like the ones that cause botulism, can survive heat, and they can happen in things like home bottled goods. Back in Duran's day, however, there was no way of knowing for sure whether the food was safe. But from a personal point of view, I've got to say, the more bacteria there is on one of these dishes, the more it smells like a pair of cheesy old socks that have marched to Moscow and back again.
And that's not the only problem. Apparently, these first cans carried labels that read, "Cut round the top near the outer edge with a chisel and hammer." These cans were mainly served to the army. And as if fighting in a war wasn't hard enough, those poor soldiers had to cut the cans open with bayonets or smash them open with rocks to get to their food and get the energy they needed to fight on. In fact, can openers were not invented for another 30 years.
This first type of can opener never even left the grocery store. A clerk took the lids off before they could be taken away. So shoppers had to walk home like this in order to cook their dinner.
However, the process of getting food out of a can was on its way to being somewhat simpler when, in 1858, a man named Ezra J. Warner of Waterbury, Connecticut, patented the first can opener. He based his design on the tools the military had used, an interesting fusion of a bayonet and sickle. Actually, all the early models did not seem quite that easy to use. One can only wonder about the inspiration or injuries that lay behind them. Years later, a somewhat more user-friendly model appeared, the first opener with a wheel. So finally, 115 years after the invention of the tin can, the first relatively safe version hit the market. The only difference, the wheel now had a crenate edge. No longer did opening a can of peas mean risking one's fingers. Some call the can opener the greatest American invention ever, especially when you're hungry and staring at a can of food.
Back then, opening cans might not just cost you a few fingers, they might also explode spontaneously.
The Napoleonic Wars had brought the tin can to life, spreading it quickly across the globe through the hands of travelling soldiers. But the can hadn't reached the masses yet. The first cans were handmade, making them too expensive for the majority of the public. A good worker could make 4 cans in a day. Nowadays, it's about 400 cans per minute. That's a whopping 50,000 times faster. A much-needed increase due to the big wars of the 19th century. All these sprawling military forces needed to be fed during conflicts like the Crimean War, American Civil War, and Franco-Prussian War. The soldiers fighting these wars in America and Europe returned home spreading the word about this miracle can that could preserve food for years on end. That's how the world slowly learned about the can, even though the can still had some rather unappetizing aspects.
By the 1860s, the time required to cook food in sealed cans had been reduced from around 6 hours to only 30 minutes. Mind you, canned food did still cause diseases from botulism to lead poisoning. Indeed, the lead content of cans was only seriously reduced as late as the 1980s. That's barely 30 years ago.
So why did the seemingly breakthrough invention of the can remain potentially dangerous for so long? For that, we're about to head into a story dealing with life on the smallest scale. Back in the 1800s, mankind had no knowledge of these little creatures called bacteria. Odd, really, to think we didn't know, and yet bacteria are just about the most omnipresent creatures around. They're everywhere. But someone did discover them. In 1859, a Frenchman called Louis Pasteur finds the scientific explanation for the preservation method behind canning. Indeed, 50 years after the invention of bottled and canned foods, we find out why it worked. Louis Pasteur found this out by disproving a theory that had held sway for 2 millennia, the theory of spontaneous generation. According to this theory, both food spoilage and diseases had some kind of spontaneity. Both came out of nowhere for no apparent reason, until Pasteur proved that microorganisms are behind both. How did he prove all that? How did he prove the presence of microorganisms so small we can't even see them with the naked eye? Pasteur set up a test with broth. He placed broth in vessels with rather silly shapes. Some had long, tortuous necks, bending sideways, bending upwards, or not bending at all. Some vessels had short, little fat necks. What was Pasteur trying to prove? The silly-shaped necks would bar dust particles, possibly carrying funky stuff, even though the necks would allow for oxygen to come into the broth. Guess which broths turned bad? Right, only the broth in the short, little, straight and fat-necked vessels. Nothing grew in all the other broths, except in the flasks that were kept completely open. Conclusion? One needed more than just air to spontaneously make the soup go bad.
Pasteur concluded that the living organisms that grew in the broths must have come from the outside, from spores on dust, rather than being spontaneously generated from within.
And the weird necks stopped the organisms, because even germs can't defy the laws of gravity. If germs were the cause for fermentation of food, Pasteur postulated, it might be germs that are the cause of diseases as well. And indeed, germs are the cause of many contagious diseases as a result of food spoilage, such as potato blight and anthrax. The test with broth was one of the last and thus most successful experiments in disproving the theory of spontaneous generation. Surely Pasteur must have been glad to discover the germ.
Pasteur's discoveries won him the Nobel Prize, and his name's still mentioned on milk cartons and bottles today because the method we use for milk preservation is called pasteurization.
Basically, pasteurization preserves food without the need to boil it. Appert's method, on the other hand, sterilizes food by cooking or boiling it at high temperatures, up to the point that it loses its flavor. But pasteurization does not kill all microorganisms in the food or liquid either. Instead, pasteurization aims to reduce the large number of microorganisms so they're unlikely to cause diseases. Pasteur discovered that most heat-resistant microorganisms could be deactivated at temperatures below 100 degrees Celsius. Hence, his process allowed for food preservation that maintained more of its flavor.
But pasteurisation requires food to be kept cool and eaten before its expiration date, so this method's only sometimes used for foodstuffs in cans. In other words, by the end of the 19th century, even though we had a much better idea what goes on inside a can, the food still wasn't the tastiest around, and nor was it the safest.
Legend has it that in the year 1894, mysterious explosions kept a warehouse superintendent awake. The warehouse superintendent supposedly came into the store to find out who or what was banging in the middle of the night. Perhaps he was carrying a hammer, or a bayonet, or something much more practical, to discover that something had mysteriously caused the store's cans to burst. A professor by the name of H.L. Russell was called in to solve the mystery. Professor Russell developed a theory that helped him to determine whether it was heat-resistant bacteria that caused canned food spoilage. What he found was that it was indeed one of these bacteria that caused the buildup of gases within the can, hence the mysterious explosions. He then went on to determine the time needed to sterilize different types of canned food. Russell's discovery led to an increase in the time and temperature of boiling during the canning process, as well as greater safety in canned food production. Slowly but surely, the tin can became the image that we know today, that safe and long-lasting package for food and beverages. Canned food and drinks have become almost ubiquitous, and yes, they are pretty safe nowadays. But will they survive in the years to come? In an era where fresh food is considered best, is canned food going to disappear?
Even though modern canned foods don't normally carry harmful bacteria, and even though cans don't normally spontaneously explode, and even though we can can just about anything from hamburgers to oysters, canned ingredients are still seen as less healthy in the eyes of the public. But this is simply not true. 50 years after the invention of bottling, a forefather of canning, we found out why food is preserved this way. But we also discovered that canned food can actually kill people. Why does cooking and sealing food make it last for months, even for years? And what can go so terribly wrong with the process that it turns the tasty contents into a lethal weapon?
The preservation process behind both canning and bottling prevents the growth of bacteria in the food. We call it sterilization. But this sterilized food didn't do well in the market. The main reason was this process had a not-so-great impact on the taste and the look of the actual end product.
So, sterilisation usually doesn't make a product look any better. And if canned foods were to have a fruitful future, something needed to be done. Scientists had to solve the issue of the so-called cold spot. In order to destroy any organisms causing disease or spoilage, excess heat needs to be applied to the outside of a container for long enough to ensure that the central portion, or cold spot, has been thoroughly cooked. The only problem is excess heat robs a food of its juices, texture, nutrients and flavour, rendering it bland and taste-free, effectively useless.
But there is some good news. Modern methods of canning have made a difference. The newest method of canning food is a combination of factors that can make your head spin. And it has some interesting features. Using a combination of existing technologies, today's canned food has certainly evolved and become more tasty. Radappetization. The term is a combination of two words, radiation and appert. Remember Nicolas Appert, the Frenchman who bottled sterilized food for the troops of Napoleon? Radappetization is a process of preserving foods by not only canning it, but by vacuum sealing the cans and then sterilizing them with ionizing radiation of all sorts. That is, by using either gamma rays of cobalt-60 or cesium-137, X-rays or electrons, effectively zapping your supper into keeping its most nutritious value. Nonetheless, the current trend is pushing fresh, organic foods for nutrition and health. The crazy fact is, canned fruits and vegetables often provide as much nutrients as their fresh counterparts. Sometimes the canned variants contain even more dietary fiber and vitamins. For example, canned pumpkin can have 5.5 times the recommended daily intake of vitamin A, while fresh pumpkin only provides a fourth. But how can that be? The reason is, foods that are specially farmed for canning purposes are treated differently. Canned foods are often packaged within hours after harvesting. These foods are canned almost directly from the fields. Fresh fruits and some vegetables are often picked before they ripen or mature, which does not give them enough time to develop their nutritive value. On the other hand, the fruits and vegetables grown for canning purposes are mostly harvested as late as possible, at a time when they are nutrient-packed. However, food from a can does have its disadvantages. The canning process will reduce the amount of nutrients that are particularly heat-sensitive, such as vitamin C and folic acid. Also, it's not uncommon for canneries to use additions like sodium and sugar. But all in all, canned food can be really quite healthy. The can itself is also not one to stand still. It's improving with revolutionary packaging designs. Cans now come in all shapes and sizes, quite often just because funky shapes sell better. Research has shown that a can with a quirky design can increase sales by 16%. Guess consumers like something different.
Sometimes there are practical reasons for funny-shaped cans. Corned beef, for instance, is said to come out easier from a tapered can. Well, that certainly was easy. In 1866, a man named J. Osterhout patented a tin fitted with a special key. You simply inserted it, then twisted to unwrap and reveal the goodies within. Nowadays, many cans are fitted with easy-to-peel lids. Perhaps because of this, the can opener will be consigned to the dustbin of history. Very fortunately for us, none of the inventions and discoveries that went into bringing us canned food have been wasted. Pasteurisation, for example, works well with many foodstuffs like milk, and all medical equipment is now sterilised before use. Canned food began as a solution for starving soldiers. It gained a reputation for being tasteless and also for being risky, as it could cause lead poisoning and botulism. But developments in present-day preservation techniques mean that canned foods now can be healthier than fresh foods. So next time you look at that can sitting on the supermarket shelf, remember, it doesn't just contain baked beans. That can is filled with science.